Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. These skills allow us to organize our behavior over time and override immediate demands in favor of long-term goals. We have now done more than 150 episodes, and I continue to tackle three important goals. My first goal is that through these discussions, you should know that uncovering the role of prefrontal lobes is a great start to figure out how executive function skills work. If anything, my guests help us walk through and showcase how complex and interlinked executive function skills are to self-control, self-awareness, and even potential self-actualization. Secondly, I'm interested in tools for self-change. And for that, we need to understand that the plight of the new and improved future self, which is completely dependent on the effort and insights cultivated by the current self. So we need to create some continuum. And lastly, I hope to help you, listeners, to create a playbook for your personal success by mastering these amazing set of skills that we call executive function. So as we dive into today's important topic, I want to kind of set the stage for self-regulation, which is facilitated by invisible rules. And those invisible rules are imposed by culture. So let me quickly share a story. I grew up in India, and I was always fascinated by different cultures, because in India, I like to tell people it's more like a continent than a country, because different states have their languages, their different ways of eating, different way of dressing. And so when you travel, you definitely notice, and when you interact with people from different parts of India, it is almost seeing person from another country. And I would love to share a story about my mom. You know, she grew up in a tiny town in the state of Maharashtra. Her family was mostly poor. She talks about stories from her childhood, and they're almost always demonstrative of how norms and expectations incite behaviors of self-control. For example, you know, every time she stepped out of the house as a child, she was never allowed to take food if it was offered by somebody. That was just her family rule. If somebody, by golly, happened to give, like cousins and aunts and uncles, they were the kids, all kids, there were 7 of them, were required to bring the food home and share with siblings. And so imagine the self-control of not eating something delicious during Diwali, which is Festival of Lights, you know. Another thing was very typical of my mom's household was observing fast, which is, you know, going all day without food or water intentionally, waiting till sundown to eat, or eating food that's allowed, so to speak. So there's another great example. My grandmother, the only equivalent concept I can say is kosher, but it's not kosher. There's another, it's called sovla. But anyway, so my grandmother always cooked meals without tasting them. And so you're serving this food to whole family of 9 people without tasting, and her food was absolutely delicious. So the reason I'm sharing this is that when we talk about improving executive function, we shouldn't simply focus on managing goals with great resolve, but we rather need to broaden the lens and take a look at the context and activate self-regulation and self-management using skills that need to be woven into the larger place that you belong. So with that in mind, it's such a pleasure to invite Dr. Sabine Doebel, who is an assistant professor at George Mason University. She is interested in cognitive development, with much of her research to date focusing on the development of executive function. And this is an important a piece of information for us, because there's not a lot of work regarding the milestones, what kind of skills are expected from children, what is the norm. We are still figuring out as a field. And so she is focused on the ability to control thoughts and actions in service of goals, especially in the face of conflicting habits, desires, and tendencies. She's particularly interested in how social and conceptual processes may support the development of skills in using control across contexts. So She has a great TEDx talk, and she also has written some amazing papers. Particularly, we'll be discussing about the infamous or famous marshmallow experiment. So, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm good.
Well, great. Well, we all always ask our guests, since we talk about executive function and goal directed effort. And I love psychologists because they are so insightful. I would love to know how you were as a child, what kind of knowledge and understanding you found yourself discovering about your own ability to control your goals or behaviors to achieve goals.
Yeah, I think that I was very different than I am now. It's quite strange. I really, if I, look back, I would say I didn't have very good executive function. Um, yeah, it's really true. I was kind of, as a teenager, I was a bit of a rebel, and I got into
Really?
a fair amount of trouble. Yeah. But, you know, I became more interested in academics as time went on, and that kind of helped me navigate into a better direction. And
I
here
love
I am.
that. I love that.
um,
And what's so interesting
but
about that is, I guess, you found your mission. You found goals to commit to that kind of gave you the motivation and effort, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I was kind of after I graduated from college, I really wasn't certain that I wanted to pursue psychology, and I had done a lot of coursework in social psychology, and I had some interests here and there, but nothing really fully developed. And so I actually went back to school and was studying other things like philosophy, and I kind of, in this very roundabout way, came back to psychology because I was interested in how thinking develops. I was interested in thinking generally, cognitive just processes, and how it is that we as humans are able to think the things that we can think. And I just thought the best way to answer these questions would be to study them developmentally and empirically. And so that kind of got me into developmental psychology. And from that point, I was just so driven and goal directed, like you I was like making up for lost time,
Well,
basically.
that's great. That's actually very much maturation of intentions. That's what one of my colleagues says.
Mm-hmm.
So, executive function
Mm-hmm.
refers to set of mental skills we use to manage our thoughts, emotions, and actions to achieve goals for self, in accordance with the context
Mm-hmm.
and by bringing a coherence to it. When you and your work in your work think about executive function, what kind of conceptual framework you use, and how does this definition sit with you?
To be honest, I'm still working through my ideas about this, but they're definitely shifting away from this idea of executive function being these
Hmm.
general processes that we apply. Yeah, so this is going to be a very interesting conversation because I really, I think it's very deeply affected by context and knowledge. I think that we all have some capacity, capacity is the only term that I can use that kind of feels right for the kind of general thing that people vary in terms of how you know good they are at controlling themselves and controlling their thoughts and actions. But you know that is one piece of it, and there's so much more that's interesting for me, just like understanding how knowledge affects and knowledge in different areas affects how you can use your executive function. So as I said earlier, when I said that I was, as a child I had bad executive function, I was being facetious because really I don't believe that I had bad executive function. I just think I didn't know how to use it very well in certain situations. In some situations maybe I was good. I can't think of any right now. But now I think I am very good in some situations, and I'm still poor in many situations. So it depends on what I care about and what I know about and how practiced I am in certain things. And
I
yeah,
like
so
to
that's how
use
I
this
think about it.
analogy of a car. So, your car is engine dependent. So let's say that's your brain and the skills that you bring. But there's something to do with the driving, the ability to drive. So those are the learned skills. But then comes the
Mm-hmm.
road. So a dirt road and the car performance is going to be very much different than a 4-lane highway. So I feel executive function is so context dependent in that
Mm-hmm.
way. But I think the biggest thing to me
Mm-hmm.
in this profession is it's not an absolute ability. It's how you utilize this ability based on upping and downing of the requirements. So for example, if you are on a highway, you are
Mm-hmm.
required to abide by the law of 65 miles an hour. And if you go over, you're going to get a ticket. And that knowledge feeds your car's capacity, which can
Mm-hmm.
drive 150 miles an hour. I'm making this up. But on the dirt road, you don't have any
Mm-hmm.
restrictions,
Mm-hmm.
but the dirt road is so bad that you will flip. And you don't know that until you flip. So I think that's when I feel one of the benefits of, or rather,
Mm-hmm.
the part of when I worked on retraining, one of the ways that I help people is expand their repertoire, create a deck of experiences, whether they are imagined or the true experiences, to know in what ways things will work. Because a lot of this is like, I don't know what to do when I'm locked out
Mm-hmm.
of my house. Only I have to get locked out of my house, but that's a costly affair, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you need to have some mental modeling of, if I'm locked out of my
Mm-hmm.
car, I can apply that knowledge to being locked out of a house. So anyway, if
Mm-hmm.
that makes any
Right.
sense. So
Right.
so then, the marshmallow experiment from 60s and I guess 70s certainly brought the topic of self-control into the cultural consciousness. But sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it has misled us to think that it is an end-all thing. So before we begin
Mm-hmm.
as to why so, let's start by defining self-control. And
Mm-hmm.
isn't self-control more of a narrow term as compared to executive function, which is a broader construct?
Again.
And you're interested
Well,
in
I guess
seeing,
it
right?
depends on who you ask.
Well, I'm curious as to what
Because
you
sometimes
think.
you hear the reverse, right? Yeah, I think of it. Yes, as an executive function researcher, I would tend to think of executive function as being the broader construct, actually, because I think that we use executive function in numerous ways, including regulating appetites and the things that would fall under kind of more of like the self-control kind of resisting temptation idea. But others would say, there's delay of gratification, and that's supported by these executive function processes, among other things. So some would kind of put it underneath,
Hmm.
self control, as like kind of like the supporting abilities. But um, I yeah, I mean, I then there's also kind of, the self-control kind of comes more from the social psychology, personality literature, more about kind of traits and predicting, making long range predictions from how somebody is capable of regulating themselves in childhood. So kind of individual differences, stable traits. And, obviously executive function has a very different origin as a concept. And so I sometimes just don't even try to integrate anymore. Like I kind of, I know how I think about these things, but I don't necessarily believe in some of the kind of projects of just let's kind of come up with like the one unifying kind of definition and we'll fit everything in neatly and it all will work out nice. It's like I don't know that that's actually possible or
Necessary,
even
yes.
necessary, because these different concepts come from different um, research traditions, and there's definitely overlap, of course, but I don't think there's necessarily a way to reconcile everything, and like, yeah, not necessarily something we
But
need
I
to
do
do.
do.
But I know people disagree with
Well, because
that.
I was
But
going to ask you, like, there is a general agreement, though, that these are set of skills, and these set of skills can help you achieve goals, but the goals are for self, created by self
Mhm.
and executed by self. So, like I like to say,
Yeah.
when you have a child in the classroom, whose rules the child is following, not self set. So unless you
Hmm.
create a rule saying that I
Hmm.
will follow my teacher's guidance, then that's a rule I impose on myself. Then I'm
Hmm.
self-regulating, but I'm pretty much asked to not talk, not interrupt, not shout out answers. So in that way, there is that interplay between self as a independent entity and then self in the context of others as a
Hmm.
regulating body, I
Hmm.
suppose.
Right. And when you say as a set of skills, you're talking about the skills, for example, are you talking more about, working memory, updating, flexibility, and inhibitory control like that? Or are you talking more about like the actual real world skills that are, involving executive function, like sitting still, listening to instructions?
Well, so I see it as a little bit more uh, com- more broader. Again, because I'm a
Mm-hmm.
clinician, I'm not a researcher, but the way I see it is you have internal cognitive and affective skills. So that's how you
Mm-hmm.
pay attention, how you regulate your attention, which is not just
Mm-hmm.
paying attention, but knowing what to pay attention to and
Mm-hmm.
continuously paying attention to that until processing is done, or just taking a
Mm-hmm.
decision to switch attention, for example. Then the second
Mm-hmm.
set of skills would be, for example, monitoring information in working memory and making reference to long term storage. So, do I understand what is being spoken? Do I understand? Do I have a question about vocabulary? Do I even know when, like, can I retain components? Like, don't open the window unless the door is closed. Requires me to first check the window, then the door. That reorganizing is a critical skill at a cognitive level. But when we talk about mental flexibility, it is it is about the theory of mind and perspective taking. So I need to
Mm-hmm.
see me as you see me, but I also need to see what all roles and responsibilities I have as a student, as a learner, as a thinker, as a daughter, as a son. So I feel like that in that way, it, helping people to improve their executive function cannot be achieved by focusing on set of these random abilities. They have to be in the
Mm-hmm.
context of use, and use needs to be
Mm-hmm.
defined collectively from
Mm-hmm.
onboarding the child, onboarding the family, and onboarding the school's needs or whatever, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. I really like that. I guess for me, I I kind of push back at the idea that we can actually come up with like a finite set of executive skills. I think that really you could make a very long list and you could extend it indefinitely, depending on, the child, the context, the cultural
Absolutely.
context.
But
Yeah, so that's kind of what I think
but again,
about.
I can give you the
Hmm.
reference of our field, cognitive retraining, and we use something called functional
Hmm.
rehabilitation. So, functional training is the context
Hmm.
of use and context of need. So, before we do any intervention, we do needs assessment. So, let's say if your biggest challenge is as a PhD student, you're not getting started with your thesis, and you just don't know where to begin and you're procrastinating. So, giving some random strategies to prevent procrastination has no use, because you need to really know why you're either do you not have your topic sorted, or you have no research data that supports your idea, or you don't know how to delineate
Hmm.
information from 10 papers into one consolidated idea. So I think that's what I
Hmm.
mean
Hmm.
by, you cannot help people improve their functionality without knowing where they're failing and why they're failing, and is this something they want to do.
Hmm.
Because one of the things I tell my clients and my patients, that the goal is you should not need me, because you can improve your executive function
Hmm.
because of external aid, and that's not true executive function mastery.
Hmm.
So as long as you have your mom helping you, you are
Hmm.
getting to school on
Right.
time. As long as your dad is printing the paper and running to school, you are getting your paper turned in. That's not true skill. That's just support. So that's where I come from about understanding intervention is not pure skill ability, but context and making a person responsible for their lives.
Right. Right. Hmm.
So then let me ask you this: as a cognitive neuroscientists say that in addition to allowing resisting of temptations, there another crucial role executive function plays is that it makes many things possible. Mentally playing with ideas, taking time to think before acting, meeting novel unanticipated challenges, staying focused or engaged.
Hmm.
So how do you see a connection of those skill set? And actually, we see that in play, right? So how do
Hmm.
you? What are your thoughts about this idea that more than, which you kind of talked about, is resisting temptation as the end all skill set?
Um, well, yeah, I mean, resisting temptation is just one thing. And I think that the controversy really centered around this idea that it was just this ability that you either have or you don't. And, you're kind of, in trouble if you don't have it. And, you're going to, you wait the full 15 minutes and everything's going to be success. And, you know, and that obviously that's,
For the
yeah,
marshmallow.
the marshmallow test. And
Yes.
like, obviously that's not true. And I would, I'd have conversations with parents when I would run these tests in the lab, and I'd have to explain to them, there's always other factors involved. It doesn't mean that executive function isn't playing a role. It just means that, whether or not someone chooses to use executive function or whether or not they're able to kind of carry that out through the full 15 minutes from the marshmallow test, for example, depends on lots of different factors. Depends on whether you came into the lab hungry or whether you ate a snack right before coming in.
That's such a good observation, by the way.
Oh yeah,
Nobody thought about that.
well, yeah, we, as a researcher, you do think about it because you want your study to work out, and you need to be thinking about, like, let's make sure that the parents are, not giving their kid candy right before they come in, because that might mean they're not going to be really tempted by this marshmallow. And other factors, like some children are maybe more inhibited in that situation, and lots of different things. And in my study, we looked at how their beliefs about what their group members are doing and what they value, how that would affect their behavior. And yeah, we found that they
Yeah, can you
tended.
share the experiment, how you went about it? So there's
Sure.
definitely, and two things I love about your research is one, we really didn't have a good sense, even skills like theory of mind, that how young can kids be who are demonstrating skills. So you test itty bitty kids, which is age 3
Yeah,
and 4.
but I mean, really, they're not. These are children are using an executive function very, very early in
Very
life,
young,
in
6 months.
infancy. And it's
Yeah,
interesting when you go back into the literature that they used to think that it wasn't like, it was
possible.
around 12 years of age that you started to have an active frontal lobe. And that's, but then some researchers kind of documented, there's this one paper, and I can't remember the names of the authors, but they really talked about all these different tasks that weren't your classic executive function tasks, but you could see how they involved executive function. And they surveyed this entire literature showing, like, actually children are using executive function in all these different ways. And then, more recent work has looked at infants, and actually some classic work like by Adele Diamond and Yuko Munakata and others, where they've looked at the A not B
Yes.
task from this executive function lens. And yeah, so I'm very strongly convinced that children are capable of using executive function really early on. It's just a matter of learning the ways to use it that are relevant for functioning well in their context, in their culture. And so if you want me to talk about the marshmallow
Yes,
study,
please.
the way that this came about actually was that I was just kind of thinking about some work that was being done where children were being trained. So children from disadvantaged backgrounds were being trained to on some tasks, executive function tasks, with the hopes that this would kind of improve their executive function in a way that would then apply to their everyday lives. And I just kind of thought, that's probably not going to work. It's not, and it's not because you didn't train it long enough. It's just that is just, to me, that just underlies, it suggests that the way we're thinking about executive function is not right. It's not this thing that you can just practice in a particular way, and that's going to strengthen the brain area that is responsible for executive function or the executive function skills, and then you will be able to apply it in all these different important contexts. And so the way I went about it, I guess as a first step in this direction, was to I wanted to explore how values and beliefs could affect how executive function is engaged. And so I brought together the marshmallow paradigm with this other well-known finding that you can manipulate how children identify with others just by giving them like a t-shirt and saying, you're in the orange group, here's your t-shirt. And you can, just with a simple thing like that, you can get them to say that they like that group better than another group that wears a different color t-shirt, or that they want to give candy to their own group members, and different things like that. And so we basically assigned children to a group and gave them the t-shirt, and then told them that their group waited for the 2 marshmallows, and the other group, the ones wearing the orange t-shirt, they didn't wait. And then in a different condition, we did the opposite, where we told them that their group didn't wait and the other group did. And then we left them to wait for the 15 minutes. And we found that the kids who believed that their group waited were themselves able to wait longer. And the way that I interpret this is that they were using executive function just in light
Identity.
of these beliefs, or the belief.
So I do have a question about that. How did you reconcile with those who did not identify themselves as green shirt wearers or orange shirt wearers? Is there any mechanism that makes you want to belong? Or because this too sounds to me very common human tendency to want to belong. So is there a reason other than failure of self-control that people wearing certain color t-shirts ate one marshmallow because they don't want to identify themselves? Is there, like, because it didn't feel like compelling enough identity? Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible. There's definitely other interpretations open for this work. We found that most kids did want to belong to their group. So, but there were the odd, children who basically didn't really want to wear the t-shirt, but we didn't find that the wearing of the t-shirt really mattered, actually. Like they still identified, they just didn't want to put the t-shirt on. Some kids just had these preferences. So but yeah, I think that might be an interesting direction to go into, further explore that. Because yeah, I think there are individual differences in how much people really want to be part of a group. And that could affect how much something like this would,
Because I was wondering, when I read your
behavior.
research, I thought, so let's take internalized quality. T-shirt is an external, right? I wear it. What if I say something like I'm an early riser, or making this up, or like I am a vegetarian, for example? Would that also add to that? Because it is an identity. Would that also support the same process, you think? Uh,
Maybe. I'm an early riser now, and I pass judgment on those who like wake up after 9 o'clock. So maybe just, yeah, I think, we would think that like the minimal groups thing, if that works, then you would think that something where there's a stronger
yes.
basis for identity would have more impact. But I don't, that hasn't actually been tested. But in our second experiment, we actually did go beyond the minimal groups, where we also said, your group also likes the things that you like. We asked kids what they like between some choices, and then we said, your group also likes those things, because we did want it to be a little more potent. And I think that would matter.
So in that variation, can you talk us how you set that up, and how did the kids respond to it?
It was essentially the same, because it was the second round of the same study, but we just said, what do you prefer? Do you prefer chocolate, or I don't remember exactly what it was, but a chocolate or gum, or playing ball, or playing with a puzzle, or different things, and then saying, what, the green group also likes all of these things that you said. And so we just assumed that would create a stronger sense of identity that would then carry over to maybe more interest and more motivation for waiting.
It's so interesting. My brother, who lives in Canada, is in India right now. He's stuck there for a variety of reasons. But anyway, because of COVID, and it was interesting. So he's staying at my mom's place, and my mom lives with us. She has moved to US to live with us. anyways, and so he was doing lots of things, taking care of her banking and all the, paying for gas, electricity for a year is what happened. And after he finished taking care of everything, and so he says to my mom, and this is an inside joke, and I'll explain in a second. But he says, "Mom, what would people say?" And my mom said, "Oh, people would say you are such an amazing, amazing young son." So when we were younger, my mother used to say, if you do this, people are going to say you're such a good, our family name is son, Kilker son.
Mm-hmm.
And so it actually worked with me and my brother, older brother. And then my younger brother came along, who's 7 and 9 years younger, and that did not work with him at all. What would people
Mm-hmm.
say? And he's like, I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
So all the practices
Right.
that as a family and a culture that my parents were able to instill in us just fell out of the,
Mm-hmm.
by the
Yeah.
wayside. It was hilarious.
Right. Right.
So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm also, I love the parts that you're talking about, which is the social factors, the norm
Mm-hmm.
values, and, trust influence children, you say, or rather, like
Mm-hmm.
many papers have written about this too, that this matters a lot. And this reminded me of, another guest I have had on my podcast, which is Dr. Michelle Gelfand. She has written a book called Tight and Loose Culture, and she studies cultures. And I was wondering if that capacity to identify, do you see, or you have some thoughts about how that would influence one's ability to regulate oneself? She says that our deep cultural programming shapes our views and warrants code switching. So, could failure to code switching be be perceived as failure in executive function?
I'm not sure. I mean, when I think about culture, I think a lot about how we tend to think that when people aren't showing an executive function in the ways that we expect or the ways that we think is important, on these tasks, um, that we think that they're showing some kind of deficit
Mm.
that needs to be remediated. And it's really interesting to me that like the construct of executive function came from the neuropsychology
Mm.
literature, and initially it was talked about much in terms of the frontal lobes, so dysexecutive function and frontal lobe functioning. And then it kind of gradually became discussed more in terms of I mean the neuropsychology literature persists, and there's the developmental neuropsychology literature, but now you hear executive function is talked about a lot in the context of typically developing children. And so when young children do poorly on like the marshmallow test or the card sorting test, that's kind of viewed as reflecting a deficit
Which is
of some
not,
sort,
yes.
right? An age-related deficit. And then in the cultural situation, it's also similarly construed as a kind of deficit that's due to disparity. And we also hear it talked about with socioeconomic status, or background, this idea that people are experiencing disparities in it's parenting and other things, stimulation for the brain, various things that are then contributing to brain-based deficits, executive function deficits. And I really don't agree with that. And I think that's a big kind of idea for me now, is to kind of really think more about how that's kind of reflecting a bit of a bias, and also just we're not thinking about the history of the construct enough, that we kind of just transported this from the kind of neuropsych literature, and some things that might actually make sense in explaining dysfunction uh, in some populations, that may make sense, but it might not actually be a good explanation of what's going on with young children or people in different
I really like
contexts.
that.
So
I think
yeah.
it's a sensible retake, if I may say. What I find, for
Mm-hmm.
example, a 16-year-old is going to be more proficient than a 14-year-old, and 14-year-old more than 6-year-old. But if you take all 6-year-olds And
Mm-hmm.
there are going to be some who are probably can lead the class, for example, have self-sufficiency. Then there's middle of the road, who just need a little bit more suggestions and guidance. And then there are some who are definitely falling behind. But if we talk about falling behind, to me,
Mm-hmm.
the way I conceptualize in understanding executive function failure or breakdown or deficit would be that not meeting
Mm-hmm.
expectations to achieve success that you are fully capable of or are desire. So the
Mm-hmm.
deficit is really there's a goal
Mm-hmm.
mismatch. I have a goal and I'm not meeting the goal
Mm-hmm.
successfully. So I don't look at it as a finite that you become a failure. You're not a failure. You as a person,
Mm-hmm.
because these are emergent skills, right? They are going to gain mastery over time because of the developing nature of the brain. But there are some uh, processes that can support and
Mm-hmm.
propel children to understand. For example, I find that when doing the work, if you kind of help children understand intent analysis, why do you think your teacher wants you to do this?
Mm-hmm.
If you make that clarification, the children are like, oh, I didn't know. Like one of the things I often see working with middle school, they'll say,
Mm-hmm.
I never thought the teacher actually prepares a lesson plan. They had no idea. So when you make them aware, like act of cooperation, so to me, social skills can really aid the process of goal attainment or interference with the
Mm-hmm.
goals that you desire, because that's measured through some sort of achievement. And I'm wondering
Mm-hmm.
what you think about that way of thinking about things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. Just this, but and for me, I think of it as in terms of knowledge, like you're providing them with more insight into what
Yes.
others expect or desire, and once they have that additional insight, that could also help them to use executive function in the way that is expected. They're just better able to kind of grasp onto the ideas and keep them in mind, for example. So I really like that. I One thing I worry about is this idea, like the brain gets talked about a lot, and it makes sense because the concept came from the neuropsych literature, and also, of course, we require prefrontal cortex in order to act, use executive function. But what I have seen a lot of, and that really concerns me, is this idea that, for example, young children are limited because of their brain. Their brain hasn't developed yet, and you see this actually in textbooks and in different places where it's just sort of like, oh yeah, they're impulsive because of these limitations. And I tend not to think that way. I think that children, you know are the way they are because, like, they have a lot of strengths,
Yes.
and I don't think people talk enough about that. They are very different, and they're not necessarily just like this deficient kind of adult, like that. Just, their brain isn't fully developed. Like, they're very playful, they're very, like, engaged with the world, and they're very positive often. And I like to think about what they're bringing to the table, instead of thinking about them as limited. Of course, the brain needs to develop, but how much of that is a function of the experiences that they need to have that they have not had yet? You can think a lot about young children, like preschoolers, kind of as, in parallel to teenagers, who also kind of get a bad rap for being impulsive and because of their brain, right? um, but there's another way of thinking about that. They want to explore the world, and they are seeking out new experiences from which they will learn and become wiser, and then, and that will shape their brain in a certain way, and they'll be capable of using executive function in particular ways because of the experiences that they've had or because of the knowledge that they have. And I think the same way of young children.
So I'm going to share with you a working title of my book that I'm working. It's The Dance of
Mm-hmm.
Freedom and Control. It's executive function to me is a
Mm-hmm.
balance between the discipline and spontaneity. It's the Goldilocks effect. You cannot
Mm-hmm.
be all controlled, because then that definitely is going to lose that playfulness, exploration, which is such an essential part of developing a self-understanding but also understanding of the world. And
Mm-hmm.
but you do need certain places where you need to rein in, because particularly if you're causing disruption, so that contextual
Mm-hmm.
cooperation. So I like to think about building executive function for as more as an art of learning to collaborate and cooperate with the world, not so much selfish,
Mm-hmm.
self-centric
Mm-hmm.
thought process. Because once you become aware that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have goals, Sabine has goals, is my goal pursuit interfering with Sabine's goal pursuit, then actually that is not a collaborative, And
Mm-hmm.
so metacognitive training is really about that. It's kind of making people, children, adolescent, and adults aware of the goal pursuit as a
Mm-hmm.
human striving. I like to think that way.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
the talking about then other part, not the deficit model, which I completely agree with you. We need to think about strength model, and development can benefit all, and exposure and practice can benefit all to improve their ability. But I also like to think like executive function skills are more like a gas in the tank. More you drive, less you will have. So your own executive function, you're more impulsive at night. There's shopping trends. People tend to spend a lot more money from 9 to 11. This just, you have less inhibition. So
Mm-hmm.
what are your thoughts about, research shows that the EF capacity sharply reduces when it must be devoted to managing lower level skills, and response to which are not automatic or fluent. So the capacity for the higher level, which is metacognitive function, is taken up. So there's a like mismatch there. Have you
Mm-hmm.
given some thought to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I definitely, lack of sleep and just being exhausted and all those things for sure, that's going to reduce your executive function capacity. And having some self-knowledge goes a long way, and that, if you know that you're capable of, or that you're prone to, shopping a lot, you might want to kind of set something up where you can't access your websites after a certain time of day, or and just, yeah, removing yourself from situations that are going to be stressful. Like I'm very exhausted by 5 p.m. because I work all day, and then I have a 4-year-old who comes home from preschool. And
Oh.
yeah, and so I know that by the end of the day, especially if I've been working really hard, my capacity for executive control has been, very diminished. And I need to not be in certain situations that are going to provoke me to be kind of irritable with family members. And so, yeah, it's about just managing that. And the thing is like, well, you can't ask yourself to be thinking about these things when you're already tired. So then it makes sense when you have more of your capacity to practice certain things, or think through certain things, so that once your executive function is more diminished, then you are able to behave in a way that is desirable for yourself and for your family members. So I think I go like, there's an interplay, right? Because you can practice certain skills, and then you can automate some things, and then you can devote whatever executive function resources you have to something else, right? And so when I think about executive function development, and we're all still developing, it's part of it is just getting better at something like automating some of what you are need to do, and then layering on more of the demands. And so for me, like, I learned to drive, well into adulthood, and I experienced that directly. Like, at first it was just like so exhausting and taxing. I couldn't talk to anybody after I would come home from a lesson. I would be just so worn out, and just like, how do people ever learn how to do this? Like, this is just too much. And then, within months, I was driving like everybody else, and I was able to have a conversation with somebody while I was driving. Now, that's not to say that it becomes fully automated. You still require some executive function skills when you're driving, but you can eventually carry on conversations. And with children, and a parallel idea is that when they're first learning social skills, like it's hard. They're learning so much and they're not able to do anything high level. They're not able to really reason about other people, like what's that person thinking about me while I'm talking. But once they've practiced certain skills, then they can have more resources to devote to kind of keeping track of, like, am I talking too much, should I let the other person talk, and things like that that are really important for social skills. So if I was to say, how could I, if somebody asked me, how could you use your executive function or train executive function to help somebody develop more social skills, I'd say just practice the core skills, and then you'll eventually have more resources that you can devote to the like higher level stuff.
And exposure to opportunities where such skills are put to test, because familiarity actually does not require executive function. So I mean, I work with families where the whole family is a family of interrupters, so they don't understand why interrupting is a bad quality, because they don't consider that as a bad quality. But then when this kid goes and any group he belongs to, he is definitely considered of less value to the group, because he doesn't listen, he doesn't actually repeat what people have said, he has not paid attention to their intentions, and he appears bossy, and eventually he gets excluded. Well, in his household, if you're not bossy, you don't get, you know screen time with the family. So yeah, in that way, I think even consider coming to a place where you begin to value expectations that make you, again, as I said earlier, belong, is something invisible to many. And that invisibleness, or the ambiguity in interpersonal and intrapersonal relationship, can be a big cost to mastering executive function. So as we end, what are your thoughts about executive function skills and um, mastery of social and relational, like those who have a lot of great social skills, for example, those who and we are learning that, right? People who are more patient, they listen better, get more friendships. People who actually show empathy for other person's condition, or are able to demonstrate compassion, get or feel are perceived to be more likable, those kinds of things. So as we end, I was also interested in something you have written recently about less structured versus more structured. COVID has really given people a window into how difficult it is to educate children, and parents have unfortunately become teachers, which is not necessarily their job, but also not their skill set. And I feel my heart goes out for them. But I think the temptation is to, in order to get kids to produce, there's so much imposition and creating structure, but that can be extremely counterintuitive to the developing of creative mind. So you have written a little bit about that. Do you mind sharing with us what your viewpoint is on this one?
Sure. I've been really interested in, especially like you said, with COVID, that obviously was an inspiration, is just knowing that all these children were at home all day for days on end, and just wondering, what are people doing, and, what should they be doing? What would be optimal for their development? And so I knew of previous work by my mentor, Yuka Munakata, where they found that children who had less structured leisure time tended to show better self-directed executive function. So that's kind of the self-initiated executive processes. And I that work is really interesting, and I thought, we could kind of build on that here by looking at just not just leisure time, but what are kids doing, all day? Like how is their time being structured at home, just to get a window into how that might support executive function. And my idea was a little bit different, that it's not necessarily just supporting self-directedness, but basically just having more variety in activities, and just being able to, for example, show interest in something and then have that supported. And it's not necessarily that it's completely unstructured, like there can be some structure there, but kind of this give and take of showing some interest and kind of being given some activities and variety of activities, and that this would give children a lot of knowledge that could then help them use executive function in the ways that are valued. And so we tried to test it with more than one task, but one of our tasks didn't quite work out. But we used the card sorting task, which is this widely used measure of executive function, not self-directed executive function. And the way I think about the card sort is that it is kind of I don't think of it as tapping like the core executive process of cognitive flexibility. I think of it as a culturally kind of embedded task where you're asking a child to use executive function. You're asking them to sort cards by a dimension like color or shape, and then you are after a while asking them to switch and do it in a different way. And then there's all these assumptions that are built in here where that the child is actually kind of understanding the I think, for example, the child, and kind of relating to what we were talking about earlier, the child may be thinking about what does this person want from me? Are they used to being instructed on what to do, in this way? Are they used to being, sorting by these different dimensions and kind of doing these arbitrary tasks? Some kids definitely probably have more experience with that than others, and that could help them engage their executive function in a task like that. And I think that the less structured time provides more opportunities for learning about shapes and colors and learning about a variety of things that even engaging in pretend play and different things that are going to give you more insight into others' minds and what they expect of you and things like that can then help children use executive function on that task and perhaps in other ways.
Yeah, and I think what got me thinking about is the most critical part about that is the opportunity for choice making. I think when, as a young developing mind, multiple ways you continue to make choices for yourself, that is a sort of exploration without conditions. Because only when you have a repertoire of doing that, then you kind of are able to go with a choice that's not yours, because many ways things can be done. And this is sometimes lost on parents or teachers who are trying to create these amazing opportunities, but it's not the child's idea. And it's kind of get lost in the shuffle, I feel. I have a great story of my firstborn. When he was 2, we had a big floor puzzle with one, number 1 with one fish, number like two numerical, 2 lines as 2 with 2 oranges, and it was a foam puzzle. And you had like 8 kites and 9 bears and whatever, and then you remove, and for hours he used to do that, hours. And then 10 would be 1 and 0. Oh, sorry, 1 would be 1 stick, 2 would be a numerical letter and a number and all that stuff. One day, and then he would dismantle it and put it in the box, and then take that empty shell of a foam and hang, put it against the wall. One day he was playing, and he was, mind you, only 2 years old. It blew me away because what he did is the 1 was missing in 10, or 1, like it doesn't matter. So he started his puzzle 1, 2, 3, 4. When it came to 10, he had all 10 apples, but it was only 0. There was no 1. So he went and picked up the 1 from 1 and put it in 10. So he had the flexibility to finish the puzzle, full well knowledge that the 1 will be empty now. But I just fell out because there was no way I would have given him credit to do that if I had not just watched it. But and anyways, that just is such a beautiful story to me, because that's how he learned multiple application of that numerical 1. Anyways, so I do think that sometimes it's
Yeah.
witnessing that is so beautiful.
Absolutely. And I mean, it resonates with me. That's the kind of parent I am. So it's really easy for me to be enthusiastic about that and just letting my child take the lead and letting him do what he's going to do, and kind of like, encouraging, orienting, in terms of what we value, the kinds of things we do want him to learn, but not dictating like this is what you're going to do. And just letting him kind of, we end up doing is giving him a lot of opportunities to observe what we're doing at home, and then we find that he then incorporates a lot of that into his play and different things. And so, and I absolutely love watching him do different things, just seeing what his mind comes up with, things that I would never think of course.
Well, I am so excited to have gotten a chance to talk with you, and really, this has been a very meaningful conversation. Particularly, I love the way you are challenging our field to broaden its own mind. And from my work in the field where I'm actually working and helping people, this is where I see that executive function skill is not making somebody perfect, because that will be such a false way of thinking. It is actually a process of helping people help themselves. And what they need help with is how can they be most effective in leading most meaningful lives. But the defining of meaningful life has to be done by them as well. And a good support and therapy is that. And like you and I, it took you a while to figure out this is your field. It took me a while to say, oh my God, I love what I'm doing. And thank God somebody was patient. The universe was patient with us because once you're in your zone of excellence, I think you can make such a big difference. So I really appreciate that. So as we end, do you have any recommendations for our listeners? Any books that have influenced your thought or things that really get you very excited? We would love to know that.
I don't really have time to read books lately, the last 4 years, really, because of my son. He's kind of, taken some of that time away, but, which, of course I'm happy because he's amazing. But, so I can think about some books that have influenced me really, and it's not really an endorsement of all the ideas in them, but I tend to enjoy books that challenge my thinking, challenge my assumptions. And, I've been attracted to reading authors where are kind of controversial even, and just seeing what is it exactly that they say? Like, what do they really say? I don't want to just listen to what other people say that they say. So one book that was really influential for me at one point was Practical Ethics by Peter Singer, who is, he's actually quite controversial in some ways. But some of his ideas I really liked, and of course I'm not giving a full blanket endorsement of everything he says, but I just he talks about a lot of different real world issues that philosophy has something to say about, and made me reflect on certain things. Another kind of author like this is Jonathan Haidt. He has this book called The Righteous Mind. This is pretty relevant for current times, where he talks about the left and right kind of divide, and kind of tries to make sense of it in a way that is not about saying that one side is better than the other, but just trying to understand human nature, really, like, and that's kind of where I come from, in that we're all kind of flawed humans trying to make ourselves better. And it's so that's a really satisfying book to read.
Well, thank you for your recommendations. It's been such a pleasure talking with you, and we really thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And if you love what you're listening, please share. There's a lot of ways you can get connected with us. And if you want to hear from us, definitely sign up for our newsletter. Once again, thank you, Sabine, for being here with us today. And everybody have a great day.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full PreFrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.